Oh, I don't hear.
All right. I'm going to just put, they're gone. Okay. So, so thank you so much for being with us. Can you hear me,
For having me. Yes.
Dr. Muchacha? Okay. We are at Independent Bookstore in Detroit, Michigan. And we wanted to have a read for February that wasn't too much for our community, and something that, in a book that we absolutely love from the first release. And to our delight, February 7th, this book came to be in paperback. So it was more accessible, like for people to kind of grab onto and to have. So that's sort of our introduction. We're a Black bookstore, so we were really attracted to the title because so many conversations are come up around this here in Detroit. So I'll introduce our listeners to you. She's arrived.
I was trying to put my earphones in.
Okay.
Okay. Well, anyway, hello, everybody.
Hello.
This is Janet Webster Jones at Source Booksellers. I'm in the store in our little nook in the back here. And we just want to welcome you to really the last of our slow read attempt to find a new and different way to read together and to take in a book of importance. And this one is, of course, one of great magnitude, I think, and requires all of us to kind of slow down a little bit and read. I have to quote Bayo, I can never say his last name, Abulabella, I'm not sure. He's a Nigerian person who says he is a recovering clinical psychologist. And he says
I'm looking for a nonfiction book, so I was going to just see if you might have it.
Okay.
hold on just a second, we're introducing on a Zoom. Just hold on, stay right there. So he says that time is in his podcast on Let Us Make Sanctuary. He says, times are urgent. Let us slow down. And so I think about that so often because there's so much that we're trying to do and trying to be. But I'm really delighted that you were able to join us for the last part of our slow read experiment. And hopefully we'll do a slow read again, maybe another time this year. But it's for us, we're always trying to figure out how we can do it and do it a little bit better. So Allison, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
So we're back. So I'm gonna do just a little introduction here. So Professor Chris Manjapra, am I saying it right?
Manjapra, yes.
Manjapra was born in the Caribbean and born in the Caribbean of African and Indian heritage. He grew up in Canada and completed his undergraduate and graduate degrees at Harvard. He is a professor of history at Tufts University and the recipient of the 2015 Scholar Award for Emerging Scholar from Diverse Magazine.
Right.
Studied in Berlin, UCLA. Both of these places are far from us in Michigan, but Canada not so much. And you live in Boston. So let's talk a little bit about Black Ghost of Empire. When I read the introduction, and I was just like, I can't wait to get to the rest of the book. And I want everybody to know that if you experience this book on the audio, you will hear the author's voice in the introduction, but there is a narrator that completes the book and has such a tone that it's, an easy listening. in that way too. And if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat. You can put them in the chat or the Q&A. So that's just letting our attendees know that. So my first question is, how did you come to this topic? Like how did the voids and come to your interest, I guess?
Thanks so much for having me. And it's a great time of year at the end of Black History Month to be able to talk about my book again with you all. And I'm so happy that you've read it and it's spoken to you. So yes, how I came to the book, really it has to do with the way that we have been taught to think about emancipation as an end to the history of racial oppression and racial slavery. And the more research I was doing, especially on how emancipations happened, the more I realized that emancipations were not ends, that they were continuations, they were conduits for continuation of racial oppression. And furthermore, there wasn't just one emancipation, there's a whole set of emancipations. There are emancipations taking place from the 1770s all the way up to the 20th century. And they all shared actually similar characteristics in common, which are not what we would expect. They were not in the spirit of liberation. They were in the spirit of recreating the racial order and securing the racial order. And so that's when I saw that the details about emancipation are so surprising and so disturbing that they really needed to be kind of understood together within two book covers. That's when I decided I needed to write Black Ghost of Empire. Yeah. I think you're on mute.
Yeah. Muted. You covered the
Zoom
British
experience.
Empire.
Yes.
The British Empire. What I was so struck by was Haiti.
Mm-hmm.
I think I knew parts of that history. And I knew that there was like debt and all these different things, but your storytelling made it so complete.
Thanks. Yeah.
For me.
Yes.
The French and even Cuba. Now, I was stuck on even page 7, where you had when slavery was declared, and then the reparations packages. And for some reason in our history, we think of emancipation as people being able to, be free of whatever captivity they were in, but we didn't really think about the enslavers.
Right.
Other than maybe they were disappointed, but in no way engage in reparations, like getting the reparations. Why do you think this was not known?
Yeah. Well, that's so if, like I was saying, emancipations were conduits for the continuation of racial oppression. They weren't the end that we've been taught they were. Then how exactly did that continuation, that continuity happen? And when we look at the details, emancipations, every single emancipation had and reparations that was paid. And they were structured to pay emancipations to slave owners. So, and there are varieties of ways that this happened. You mentioned Haiti. In Haiti, the Haitian people revolted against slavery in the late 1700s. There was a revolution and it was successful. And so by 1805, the Haitian people had won their own freedom. But what happened was that the French state refused to recognize Haiti as a free state until it paid reparations to the French government. So Haiti as a nation was forced to pay money and what they called the indemnity to France And it was a huge amount of money, and it created a huge debt that Haiti paid for more than 100 years. And it led to more, more and more debt. It was the beginning of third world debt. So one of the ways that emancipations, all of them worked, is by putting Black people into debt for obtaining freedom. So Black people walk into freedom with debt. That's one part of it. And the other part of it is that the state simply pays money to slave owners, and that happened. That did happen in the Haitian case as well. In the French case, French slave owners received money from the state for the loss of their lands. It happened in the American case in Washington, D.C. It happened in a big way in the British case. So these are the details of emancipation, and they go against the grain of what we've been taught. They shatter the idea that emancipation was about, let's say, justice. It was actually, these systems were unjust systems. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And this, my mother's not on, but we saw in the last part of the book. Do you want to talk about the Spelman?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
We both went to Spelman.
Oh,
and
okay.
so when we saw those pictures, we were like, oh, but it did make us remember that there were many people, including, I think, my grandmother, that went to Africa.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So that was part of, I think the founders were missionaries, or it was like a part of that, culture.
Yeah, thanks for that invitation. You asked like the question before was why did emancipations work this way? And the basic reason why they work this way is because they were based on racist ideas. That slavery was this racist idea that Black people could be property as opposed to being full people, and that idea became so deeply set in the minds of enslavers and their societies that even when emancipation came, there was still that idea of Black people not being equal to white citizens, or that somehow thinking of Black people more like property still was okay in the minds of the now post-enslavers. And what I find also so inspiring in this story, and there's this thread that is in the book in every chapter, which is about what I think of as Black reparations movements, not the reparations that were paid by states to their slave owners, but how freed Black people in fact liberated themselves or struggled for liberation. And that is a long legacy of reparations that our people have been working on and developing over the course of many centuries. One of those kinds of reparations movements was Pan-Africanism, was the work by many Black women, in fact, played a very important role in this. And I mentioned in the book, I'm just looking at their pictures now, Nora Antonia Gordon, who was a missionary and a Pan-Africanist from Spelman, as well as Emma Beard Delaney, who was also a student at Spelman and was a missionary. And they were Pan-Africanist missionaries. So at the end of the 19th century, this was a great era of Pan-Africanism, of travel between Africa and the Americas, African Americans traveling to Africa, Africans traveling to the Black Americas. There was a lot of solidarity movements that were developing. And I think it's really powerful to spotlight the role of these women travelers, these women Pan-Africanists who, for example, in the case of Emma Delaney, she traveled to today's Zimbabwe, and she worked very closely with Chilembwe, who was a ended up being a revolutionary, a leader of a revolution in Zimbabwe, to destroy the plantation system. So I think that's that's one dimension of what reparations movements look like. The idea, the work of Pan-Africanism, of basically repairing the broken ties between Africans and the diaspora that was forcibly made to leave Africa. And so I find that just so powerful, inspiring, that even as these emancipations continue to be unjust, Black communities created ways to fight for justice and to heal their communities. And I think that's what I think of these missionaries, Nora Gordon and Emma Delaney, as healers, as people involved. And they were very interested in creating bonds with, for example, African women and African children, and basically recreating kinship ties that had been broken. I just think that's really powerful and inspiring.
When my mother went to Spelman, we think she went around 1913 or 14, and she'd been a country girl down in the South and had heard about Spelman through the itinerant preachers that would come through their little village at the time. And when she got to Spelman, I think that's when there was a time period when that idea of going to Africa was sparked. Mm-hmm. And she wanted to be a missionary. That was one of the things she talked about a lot as I was growing up and even into my adulthood. And she did finally go to Africa in the 60s when those countries were becoming independent. And when she went to Liberia, she met one of the later ones that had gone to Spelman, come from Spelman over there, that was still living at that time.
Wow.
And I kind of rekindled that with her, but she always had a feeling for the idea of missionary. I don't think that she had any notion of reparations with it, but it was embedded in her when she was at Spelman. When I hear that kind of connections, it just says that we have to keep on going because the future is waiting for us, to show up.
Absolutely. That's beautiful. Yeah, I love that. And also
it's close by. When I saw this,
how close it is to your family. Yeah.
Because my mother was born, now that's how old I am, was born in 1898. Right?
Wow. Yeah, fantastic.
So her father had 100 acres of land in Georgia. And that's another story that we don't exactly know how he came about it, but the Reconstruction thing may have been part of that. And she went on her own. She didn't have any support, money, or either permission from her father, who was pretty tough.
To go to Spelman?
To go to Spelman, but they welcomed her to come and work. And so she stayed there. We know it had to be about 1912 or 1913 because we have certificates of classes that she took while she was there. And then she went on to the college that they started when she was there and graduated in the class of 29. So it's close for me. So you can imagine when I saw that in your book, I went, "Ooh, wow, there it is." I wanted to know, is the Delaney person, is that any kin to Samuel Delaney?
I don't believe so. There's, of course, the very famous Martin Delaney as well from the 1850s and 1860s, but I don't believe it's a family relationship. No, I don't think so. Yeah. What was your mother's name, by the way?
Estelle Roosevelt Bailey Webster.
Wow. Okay. Fantastic.
And she used to have slides that we would look at of McKinley. She was always a collector of things.
Wow.
So I wanted to ask another thing when you're talking about the Pan-African part, which I find very interesting. What is the connection between these women, the Pan-African Conference, and that time period, and Garvey?
Yeah, right. So, there in 1900 in London, there was what became known as the First Pan-African Congress. And at that Congress, what I learned through researching this book is that there was a a very important woman whose name is Alice Kinloch, who was from South Africa, a Black woman from South Africa who was in London at the time, who was actually the organizer of the first Pan-African Congress. So we don't know that, we don't commonly know that this was actually Alice Kinloch's main work. And she was very connected to the labor movement in South Africa, especially on organizing for the miners in South Africa and in today's Zimbabwe, and made that labor justice piece a core element of what the Pan-African Congress would be addressing. So it was one of the demands that came out of the Congress. To the Congress came a number of Pan-Africanists, really important Pan-Africanists. Marcus Garvey wasn't at that first one. W. Du Bois attended and spoke, along with a number of women missionaries. I don't know that
Frederick Douglass, a member, there?
Frederick Douglass also wasn't there for the first one, but there were other African visitors. There were Canadian, Black Canadian, African American members who attended, and it was that event that inspired Marcus Garvey in his Pan-Africanism, because he was very young at the time and was in London in the early 1900s. He might have even attended this Pan-African Congress in the audience. But around 1903, 1904 is when he started writing on Pan-Africanism, and then eventually by 1914 really begins organizing what became the United Negro Improvement Association and the Black Star Line, and all the rest that kind of emerges, the UNIA chapters, all of which had this goal of bringing African Americans and Africans back together again through travel, but also through political solidarity, through Black identity, what they would call Black nationalism at that time. And so I think that might be the way to think of it, is people like Alice Kinloch ended up being the inspiration for Marcus Garvey, and then when we invoke Marcus Messiah Garvey, we can also think of Alice Garvey, and the importance of Alice Garvey in the movement. So yeah, I think it's really, really important to highlight the role of, especially of women in the Pan-Africanist work, because it's something we haven't really traditionally done. We've kind of told the story through the men who are well named, but there have always been these women leaders who are actually very, very significant, like Alice Kinloch, like Alice Garvey. Yeah.
And the other thing that's fascinating to me is to consider the amount of back and forth across the ocean of people during that time, before and during that time period. It was just a very rich time.
It was.
Change and development and forward thinking.
And when we think of it, part of the reason why there was so much back and forth is because African Americans were facing similar challenges to what African people in Africa were facing, because after we have Civil War, we have the beginning of Reconstruction. At the same time, at that moment in the 1870s, is when we have the onslaught of the colonization of Africa. And so it's that experience in Africa of, these generally European empires coming and waging wars and taking over governments and doing it in the name again of emancipation. So that's the connection here. That's one of the connections, that these emancipations, unjust emancipations, kind of then went to Africa in the 1870s, 80s, 90s, and onwards. And in that context, when we have common problems, we find common solutions. And so I think that this moment of the 1870s and 80s and 90s and onwards was this important period of Pan-Africanism, because African Americans and continental Africans in some ways came to face similar challenges, right? Especially around matters of sovereignty, of justice, racial injustice. And they began to form alliances and solidarities together, again. And I think that's really powerful and inspiring for us today. Yeah.
The economic considerations of moving forward and being pushed back, or moving forward and getting strength. The towns that grew up, I was just looking at the book, Allison, about The Other Eden, which is a novel about Black people creating a community in Maine. I can't quite get the timing. And finding a way, really making a way, as they say, out of no way.
Yes.
And the forces that were at work during those times would create a need to join and to combine and to organize.
Absolutely. Yeah.
In great ways. Put your earphones on, Ellie. Oh.
That's true. When you mention the Civil War, when reading your book, and I taught 5th grade for a long time, and the two, your reasons for the North and for the South were totally different.
Yeah.
But they made all the sense in the world. I mean, it made sense that was, what was going on, and that was true. But
how do you mean? Do you mean like the ways that emancipation happened were different, or how do you mean the reason?
No, there's like a requirement to know the reasons for the Civil War, and like one, slavery.
Yes.
Like
Yes. Yes.
And it kind of piles on right there. But in when you discuss it, it has to do with free trade and the continuation of the Cotton Kingdom.
Right.
And
right.
so the whole, I guess, myth, of John Brown doing his thing, and then things had to change, and then we helped in it, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I'm also drawing strongly from W. Du Bois' work, Black Reconstruction, and in that argument, and some other more recent authors, historians, who point out that the context for the coming of the Civil War is not what we think it is. In other words, there was a struggle for two visions of what American expansion should look like. Right? There was one vision, which was the Union vision, the Northern vision, which was the Western expansion and the fighting of wars against indigenous peoples and the claiming of lands in the West, and the free soil movements. And there was a different vision, which was of the South, which was the expansion of a cotton kingdom that would continue, human slavery, humans as property, and the expansion of cotton, not just to the southern bounds of the United States, but on to Cuba, on to South America. There was a vision of expanding the South actually across the seas, across the Caribbean, and into South America. That was a project that was being imagined and worked out. And so what led to this war was actually the clash of these two expansionist visions. And it came to be that the Civil War, as it was being fought, increasingly became a war about ending slavery. And that had so much to do, as W. Du Bois argued, with the agency of Black people, of people who made it that way, and served as the guides, to make that the main kind of the main topic of struggle, subject of struggle in the Civil War. But that's what it became. That's not how it started. So yeah, that is a retelling of the Civil War, not to diminish the importance of the outcome of the Civil War, but to be clear about its context, how it started, and why ultimately, through fighting this war and through the reconstruction that came afterwards, why is it that we still have a continuation of, systemic racial oppression as opposed to the real destruction of it? That continues to be my question. It's like, why does racial oppression, why does it continue? Even when we're told that there are all of these systems, all of these laws, even wars that were going to end it, racial oppression, anti-Blackness, white supremacy, these things don't end, they continue. And it's not just because, it's actually, we can look at the structures and the procedures and we can see that there was design there. It wasn't an accident. There's design in why emancipations were the conduits for oppression, and also why the struggle from below continued, in different ways, in new ways, making a way out of no way, like you said. And along those lines, if I can just say one thing about making a way out of no way and this, other Edens, one other dimension, one of the many dimensions of reparations movements that I find really inspiring for us today also is the focus on land, land movements. And this goes back a long time. So we look at the 1830s in the Caribbean, places like Guyana and Jamaica. And when slavery was ending there through these unjust emancipations, what the freed people did is they created common lands. They created, what were called the free village movement. And these free villages would often be formed through collective action. People would pool money and they would purchase multiple pieces of land and bring them together, and they would cultivate those lands together. And I think, so that was something that was taking place in the 1830s. We think of the land movements during Reconstruction, right? In which, again, Black communities, like in South Carolina, North Carolina, were collectively, working on lands. And then that leads me to think of Fannie Lou Hamer and the land movements, that she was leading in the time of the Civil Rights Movement. So there's this long tradition in reparation struggle for land, and for also using land and thinking of land in ways that don't replicate the property, divisions and property on capitalist divisions that are in fact kind of, all part of how the plantations worked. There's something about common lands, collective lands, that Black people were continually struggling for, and I think struggle for today. This is really resurgent, and if I'm not mistaken, there are some really inspiring kind of mutual aid and common land-based mutual aid movements that are taking place in Detroit or in the region of Detroit. I've been hearing about that. I think that's really part of our times. It's very inspiring.
You're right.
The Nation of Islam has land in
Georgia.
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 And this sort of goes on. It always takes me back to my grandfather, my mother's father, and how he acquired. The deed said more or less 100 acres. And when we had it surveyed in the about the 90s, I think, it actually said 100 acres. And I don't have any idea of how that came about. I want to associate it with some kind of reconstruction, something, but I don't really know how it was acquired.
Well, I think the movements in Detroit, there's one that's like the city of Detroit has like a reparations committee. And I get a little pessimistic about that, but you're right. There are land collectives and cooperatives that are starting up and being imagined here in Detroit.
Yes.
The Food Security Committee took over a part of a city park, which is Rouge Park here. Big park. out on the southwest side of the city and started a farm. So there are people who have little farms inside the city, not quite the same as people's having backyard gardens, because we all had
Mhm.
those, but they have these little farms here. So you're right, the land is a major component of this desire to seek justice and freedom.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And it long has been.
Mhm,
So that's really inspiring.
mhm, mhm.
So I want our attendees, if you have any questions, if you want to say your questions, I can help you to say your question. Or if you'd like to type your question, please do, or comment in the chat. So,
And as we wait for folks to ask questions, I can mention two more key points from the book that speak to what we've just been talking about in terms of how reparations movements relate to the failure of emancipations. In other words, reparations have been long a part of our history, Black reparations, because reparations to slave owners has been the law, has been literally the law of the state. And so there are all of these ways that freedom fighters, people have been fighting for justice, social justice for a very long time. We talked about the land movements. We talked about Pan-Africanism and, highlighting, uplifting Black sovereignty. But it's interesting to me that when we, if we were to look like when was the first time that reparations was used in relation to slavery, in relation to demanding a reparations for the enslaved, not for the enslavers. That happened a long time ago, which to me is really, again, inspiring and powerful. That back in the 1790s, is when Ottobah Cugoano, who was an African freed person who had been enslaved, born in Africa, had been enslaved in the Americas, was living in London at the time, wrote a book. And in that book, he said what has to happen. I mean, he was imagining the future. What has to happen after the end of slavery, he was an abolitionist, is there has to be a reparations made. And it's interesting that in his description of what reparations should involve, it included commemoration, the commemoration for the harm, and the tragedy of slavery. And he described it as, days of mourning, right? So kind of public events to commemorate what slavery has done to our society. So I think that's important. And we see that in reparations movements today, yes, commemoration tends to be a part of what people ask for. There's just a deep root to that, which I think is important to note. And let's not forget that when we look at like the 1880s, 1890s, we think of someone like Callie House, one of the great reparationists of the 19th century, and a great inspiration to, Mother Audley Moore later on. What Callie House asked for is a just compensation to those who have been affected by the histories of slavery. And what's interesting about Callie House's vision is it wasn't like a one-time payment. It wasn't, how much do we write the check for and let's just be done with this. It was a payment that would be paid over the course of generations, that would be for the elderly, the middle-aged, and the young, and would take place over a period of time. She thought of it as pensions, in the language of pensions. And that is an old idea too, and the idea is, how do we change a system, right? And so that's what I think is so powerful. To put it in like a very simple language, emancipations continued a system of racial oppression. So reparations ideas have always been about how do we destroy that system, break that system, and create something new. It's very interesting and exciting to me that we have these discussions yet again coming. I mean, they keep coming back, right? So yeah, that's the power of history.
Mhm. It also means that those are the exact things that we need
Yeah.
to focus on. Land, overtime, compensation over time. That commemoration part is strong, is powerful, and I think that's what people are often referring to when they talk about respect.
Yes.
The commemoration part, I love that. Days of mourning.
Days of
I was listening to a program about the recognition of people who had been killed in the Holocaust, and their stumbling stones placed in, I don't even know where it was, if it was Berlin or different parts of Germany, or where you would stumble up on a stone and it would have a name and date on there. It would be a cause to remember that person, which I thought was quite artistic and powerful, and just the concept of that. So yeah, these are we keep saying it over and over again, and how to act on it gets to be the sticky part.
All right, I don't see any questions, but I do want to thank you for describing voids and in history, and also the detail in which you do your storytelling. It's fantastic.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you. That means a lot to hear that kind of feedback. You know, it's writing this book it felt like you know, it felt like digestion. It felt like digesting things that are really hard, you know.
Yeah.
And through that digestion and metabolism, processing it and finding a way to work through it and beyond it, and I think that's you know, that's also a kind of a definition of how our people heal. You know, we the experience that history gives us a lot to digest, and it gives us all a lot to digest. I mean, all of us in countries and societies affected by slavery have a lot to digest. It's a question of whether we as a society, you know, kind of do the work of digesting and metabolizing, or whether we turn our back and, you know, deny. We don't, because I mean, you know, Black communities have a special place in this story because it's so close to us. It is our history, that it is everyone's history, but we know it's our family history in very profound ways. So like at the end of the book, I talk about a novel that, you know, an amazing novel, Juneteenth. It's called Juneteenth, and it's a metaphor about reparations and what reparations really is about. And according to that novel, it's about, you know, building something new together. Like, you know, the metaphor of a vehicle, a car has broken down and is falling apart, and we have to kind of put everything back together in new ways and juice it up and get it to run. But it's a collective, you know, it's a kind of a collective project. So I find that really inspiring. You know, it's also a metaphor for healing in history, I think. And I feel like writing the book has been part of that for me. So yeah.
Awesome. I think you wrote Juneteenth, Ralph Ellison.
Ralph Ellison, that's right. Yes. Yes.
Perhaps this has been asked before, but what is your next writing? What is your next, you know, what are you thinking about next?
Yeah, thanks.
Another book or another problem or a location in the world, or what are you?
Yeah, you know, I'm feeling very called to write what I feel is like a second part to Black Ghost of Empire, but highlighting the legacies of reparative imagination, you know, basically Black reparations, and like a lot of the ideas that we've been talking about, the land movements, the commemoration movements, the different ideas around compensation and how it should take place, you know, the movements for health justice, but looking at those as a long discussion, you know, as what we might call a tradition, you know, of thinking about Black reparations. I think that would be really exciting. And there's something there that feels like it speaks to this book and kind of could be volume 2, so to speak. Yeah, I think that's what it is.
I want to step ahead of Allison because she's in the lead of all of these. But I certainly would like you to consider doing another piece with us. This was our long read, but we need to just do some more of this because I think there is a lot of misunderstanding and lack of information and pain around this whole emancipation, reparation, the whole thing. And I don't know if there's another person that we know of that's written to the extent that you have on this. So I want to put in my bid. The sun is coming in our eyes right now. That's why you're getting this light for another session, maybe in the fall, Allison. I don't know what we can do, but I would really, I agree. We have to continue this kind of conversation because the information is profound. And it's long and it's a constant life, all the time struggle. So
Yeah.
thank you for being here.
Oh, you're so welcome. And I would definitely accept that invitation. I hope to see you. Yeah, it's great.
Okay.
Thank you. So our last question. Oh, wait, no. Here we go. This is Robin Sando. I think you can maybe see the question too. If we recognize that the prioritized classes will always try to maintain both the position and the advantages, especially their material advantages, then it shouldn't surprise us that they worked up to incorporate that into all the historical political situations as they develop, including emancipation movements, the political changes that follow. And of course, we must never stop struggling against including all demands for justice and reparations. But if the whole system of the propertied, is that it? Classes is inheritedly unjust, what forms of organization, capital, are going to be capable of effectively fighting the system?
Yeah, what a great question to also end on, because that is the question. You're absolutely right, Robin, that the story is ultimately about property and the concept of property, but property is defined by those who have it and who control it, who are the propertied classes and the capitalist classes. There's the racial capitalist system is what this is all about. And so the way I'm responding to your question is to just note that we can't really think about liberation without thinking about how to undo, unsettle, and disturb that system, because that system is the problem. And so that really then raises the question about what are the different kinds of organization that we can participate in now and that we can envision in the future that are not about participating in a racial capitalist system, but about undoing it. And I take great inspiration from grassroots movements, who I think have long been asking this question and have long been finding solutions, and whose solutions are evergreen. They don't kind of get exhausted and peter out because the system has not stopped. They get reborn in every generation, and there's the sense that in history, there is some kind of power of justice that's at work that will not stop until a system of racial oppression, of property ownership ends and something new is created. I just think about where we are today with our racial ecological crisis, right? In which we have Black communities who are exposed to toxicities and to harm ecologically that is unequal to other communities. And we think of like the health crisis, same thing. So it's almost like, you know, even the natural world is telling us that something systemically has to change. And it's going to one way or another. And I think the grassroots movements are the ones that are on, you know, on the leading edge of showing us what's possible. So I think that's the question. And I want to also learn from our grassroots organizers.
Wow.
Awesome. So I want to thank you for joining us. And I think you can see what Robin's saying. I want to thank everyone that read this book with us. We do have a whiteboard through our Zoom that we can share with you of the different, you know, like CLR James actually has a book, you know.
Yeah, I'd love to see it. I'd love to see
and the person that blurbed the book, you know, Ebony and Ivory, actually, this is his book, you know, kind of things like that. So we'll definitely, once we complete it after today, we can send that to you. And I just want to just remind everyone that we have copies of The Black Ghost of Empire, and we will continue to have copies in store and online at sourcebooksellersonline.com.
Fantastic. So good to be with you both and with all of you. Thank you for coming. I enjoyed
Thank
this.
you. We look forward to more of your new work and more discussions on this.
Yes.
Yep.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Have a great evening.